networks are mostly about the people we are already lucky enough to know. So it's just about taking a deep breath and reflecting on who we're lucky enough to know, how we can help them in life, how we can support them, how we can catch up with their latest news, how they can support us from time to time. And yeah, we add to those networks from time to time. But for me, 90% of networks and networking is about the people we already know. And one of the hidden tricks within all that, and one of the most powerful things you can do, is make a magical, powerful introduction. And that's why we're focusing this particular section on making life-changing connections. So that sort of sets us in context.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who haven't attended previous sessions, we'll actually have recordings available of the previous two. The first one that we did was staying in touch. So directly to Ollie's point about the importance of networking being staying in touch. Let's get into today's topic though, Ollie. So making powerful introductions. I know that you believe that introductions can be life-changing, that you've made some and received some. So can you just set the scene a little bit for us? Why is it that introductions can be so powerful?
Well, I think anyone listening to this should just realize that they have at their fingertips and in their mind an absolute superpower. And that is the ability to make an introduction. You could do it this afternoon, you could do it after lunch, you could do it this evening. And I honestly think that way beyond writing a check to someone, way beyond a piece of advice, way beyond giving them an idea, the thing that changes more lives than anything else are thoughtful introductions. So for me, you know, I've absolutely loved over the years making literally hundreds of introductions. I've helped people meet their business partners, their investors, hundreds of clients, even the trade missions, Clean and Cool and Web Mission. We've traced over $400 million of deals through the introductions we've made during those weeks. But I've also helped people meet, and this is, I guess, I'm proudest of all, friends, lifelong friends, best friends, two life partners in the mix. One of them may even be on the call, I couldn't possibly say. And that gives me a lift as well. So I think I've given away half the secret already, which is I also enjoy it, but I'm absolutely 100% convinced that if we gave more time to thinking about the connections we could make, we would dramatically improve the lives of everybody we know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, you know, there are so many personal stories in the memory banks, Ollie, but I would love to just hear a few that come to mind for you. Powerful introductions that have been made for you, led to amazing things, and perhaps a few that you've made.
Oh, I mean, ridiculous numbers for me, that's for sure. I mean, if you think when I was starting Tenor, which went on to become the UK's largest schools entrepreneurship competition, crazy idea. Let's give out 10,000 £10 notes to school kids to use their imagination, turn them into more. That would have just been on the drawing board. If Shah Wasmond hadn't said, you should meet Andrew Reynolds for coffee, and he went on to say, yes, I'll give you 100 grand of my own money, it would never have happened. That was literally a life-changing introduction made for me. Back in the day, I was the tenant, if you like, of an office overlooking the piazza in Covent Garden. And that was the most amazing space to just have people in, from a racing driver, all with desk space, I mean, a racing driver, a TV producer. And I'm just very happy that I gave some desk space to a newly graduated Newcastle student, Ollie Royds, who went on to meet, even then, a West End theatre producer, Tristan Baker, who's on the call today. They ended up co-founding the multi-award-winning Troubadour Theatres with theatre spaces in Wembley Park and in King's Cross, and very happy to be a shareholder in that company, but more importantly, to see the friendship that's blossomed as a result. So, I mean, just life is just covered with those sorts of just sparks and introductions, sometimes where it's been very deliberate and sometimes where I've done nothing more than get them in the same space.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, those are just a handful of stories, but I know it's something that you've integrated into just the way you do things, right? So you're thinking about introductions all the time. Over the course of a day, you might, you know, make one or two or three. It's just something that you've built into to your habits, to your day, which I think is definitely a great way to look at it. So people on this call will be thinking, okay, right, Ollie, you're a super connector, right? You've made this course on building a better network, you know, Britain's most connected man. But what about me? And I think people certainly have a lot of limiting beliefs when it comes to making introductions. The first kind of broad category is this keeping your network to yourself. right? And I think people might do it for a couple of reasons. One, they might think, well, I'm not one of those super connectors that connects people. I don't really know how to go about doing it. And then the second would be, well, what if it goes wrong? You know, I'd better protect my network, because if I make an introduction that doesn't work out, what does that say about me? How would you address those concerns?
Well, the first thing to say is I would encourage everyone to just zoom right out and think of the big picture. If I was thinking about helping change someone who I love on this call, Prue Ashby, I'm going to go back to Prue, with an introduction, I can do that in a number of ways. And one of those ways is introduce someone to Prue. Literally, Prue, I think you should meet this person, or vice versa. The other two things I could do is introduce the concept of said person to Prue. Did you know about this individual? Or the concept of an organization. In other words, introducing things can just be about introducing concepts into people's minds and helping create a network map in their minds. So I think if you view it from the wrong angle, this can all be really intensive. So I think if you're not careful, you miss out then on lots of opportunities. So to answer your question, I think people assume it will take time. I think they will assume that it could reflect badly on them. So we'll go into some real tips in terms of do's and don'ts. But the thing I would always be considering, and those viewing now will do this, I'm sure, implicitly, but always be thinking as you start to evaluate a potential introduction, what's the real value exchange going on here? What is the value exchange going on here? Firstly, between the two people I'm introducing. And value could be exchanged, as you know, in lots of different ways. It could be monetary. It could be, ask yourself a slightly different question. What do each of these people that I'm considering introducing stand to gain from each other? And to what extent will one be likely to be in the other's debt after an exchange has happened? I think that's a really important question, not to dwell on for hours, but just to give some thought. To what extent are you actually asking a favor of one of those parties? And to what extent are you going to be involved in terms of your emotional, your reputational, your social capital in that exchange? If I introduce Peter to Paul after lunch, to what extent, if Peter is calling on Paul's time, am I going to be involved in that exchange of social capital? To what extent will it draw from me? Because then I'm not only asking Peter for a favor of Paul, but I'm also asking Peter a favor of me. And that's a long-winded way of saying, be mindful of who you're asking for what.
Yeah, absolutely. And that clarity is so important, isn't it? Because I think we've all probably received an email where an introduction's been made and we're not really sure what to do next. What's the expectation? Very often, either that will just be, an annoyance, or it will be something that we don't really know what to do with. So it just sits in the inbox. That value exchange, Ollie, I think it's so important to note. But also, there's a kind of dance going on here where you've got to be thinking about these social dynamics and social interactions. At the same time, you're trying to make these mutually beneficial introductions, right, that you hope will be a benefit to both. That kind of value exchange mindset, sometimes you can get into thinking about keeping score. So I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that. I make one introduction, that means you have to make one for me, or I've made 5 for you. Why haven't you made one for me yet? Talk to me about that a little bit, because I think it's really important.
Well, the first thing to say is I don't keep score, and I don't see it as a points-based system, as the Home Office might say, in any sense like that. First confession, I love making valuable introductions. It makes me feel fantastic. Second confession, thoughtful connectors get better connected. Thoughtful connectors get better connected. So there's a very karmic and natural effect that happens when you get into the habit of making thoughtful connections. 9 times out of 10, I don't involve myself in the ongoing correspondence or conversation. I used to 15, 20 years ago, but I found very quickly my time was absorbed being the third party in a lot of coffees and lunches where I really wasn't required. More than that, Nassos, 8 or 9 times out of 10, I'd probably say more, I don't involve myself financially in any way. And when I do, some people on the call will know I help people to raise money and to sell companies. And when that's happening formally, I make it absolutely clear to both parties that I am professionally and financially involved in that deal. That leaves the other 90 to 95% of the connections I make for love, for the passion of it, and because I know that it will help people on their way. I should just say briefly, Nassos, and I can slightly evangelize about this, but on the value exchange, the way to top up the value exchange between you and the person you're introducing is by keeping in touch. And the way you can keep in touch is not just through a series of catch-ups, it's just through a series of nuggets of value that you're chucking into their life throughout the year. Because otherwise, if you only call on them when you want to introduce someone to them, particularly if there's a power imbalance, you become that person that they haven't heard from for 6 months or a year, and now you're asking for something. So it doesn't have to be a series of coffees along the way. But even if I'm just mindful, going back to Peter and Paul in that example, if I've been adding nuggets of value to Paul's life over the last year, he's far more minded to take my introduction in the next few days. So I just think, to anyone listening to this, to what extent are you tending that garden of connections? Are you watering it? Are you curating it by adding helpfulness, by adding value? Because if you are, you're going to have a very full set of emotional bank accounts, to mix my metaphors, when the time comes to make or receive an introduction. So I'd have it always in the back of your mind.
It's a very good point. It ties quite nicely actually into one of the concepts you speak about in the course from Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point. Connectors, mavens, and salespeople. For those of you that aren't familiar, connectors connect people, mavens find information and share it, and salespeople promote other people's projects. And those are some of the ways that you can stay in touch with people, right? Sharing a valuable piece of information they might not be aware of, promoting their project on social media, or promoting it to relevant people. And I think that's crucial. From the frame of the person who's actually going to someone and asking for an introduction, you can obviously be specific and say, well, I'd like to be introduced to person X, right? But there's also the mindset of, how can I attract more introductions? And I know you've got some thoughts on that. So I'd love to hear you talk about that briefly.
Yeah, and I would certainly go back, Nassos, to this idea that you can help someone in multiple ways. Yes, you can make an introduction. You can tell them about someone's existence. You can give them permission to use your name on that journey. So right now I'm trying to help a fantastic entrepreneur, Sarah, who's the co-founder of Britain's largest primary schools chess challenge. Okay. Now, there are multiple ways I can do that. I'm introducing her to companies and organizations that I think could help her. I'm pointing out people, funders, things she could know about, peers that she could exchange tips with. So, in other words, the bottom of that pyramid, if you like, will be chosen introductions, but there's so much that goes above it. Typically, somebody will say, oh, do you know X and can you introduce me? And I think the crucial thing, particularly if you want to get more introductions, but also if you want to be a better introducer, is to understand the why. What is it about that person? Because when you ask why they want to meet that person, it might sound a bit challenging to start with. It will fire up a mental Rolodex in you as the connector, which will make you more helpful. Ollie, I see that you know Saul Klein. Well, I get on with Saul Klein, huge admirer of his. We're not best friends, but someone might spot, and Saul is a prolific seed investor, phenomenal entrepreneur with his father, Robin Klein. But if I said, why do you want to meet Saul, for example? Well, Saul has a habit of investing in high growth tech companies at a seed stage. He's shown that he believes in the power of backing women entrepreneurs at an early stage. All of a sudden, my mind's whizzing. Does it take me to Priya Guha at Merian Ventures? What about Sherry Coutu, another prolific angel investor? So I just think sparking that up makes you more likely to be introduced and more likely to be helped. And it helps you to help that other person as well.
Yeah, it's a two-sided equation, isn't it? And it's links back to something we spoke about in the last session in terms of, what are you sharing? Sharing information about the future, sharing ideas about your future plans, but also eliciting that from someone else. Because the more you have access to that information, the better qualified you are going to be to make a useful and effective introduction, right? It's that, that timeless principle of not just focusing on the past and the present, but also thinking about the future.
Yeah, and this is absolutely the golden secret to making better connections, making better introductions, and attracting better introductions yourself. Dare to talk about where you want to go, okay? Most of the time, people only reveal what they're doing today and where they have been. If you want to attract more introductions, share where you're trying to get to, and do it with, obviously authenticity, but your natural passion and enthusiasm, and that will be magnetic to people who want to help you. What you can then start to do is to throw examples out there of the sorts of people you'd like to meet and why. So I might see Alexandra's just talked about a sustainability example in the chat, and I'm thinking Mike Barry was exchanging with me earlier. Mike led Plan A out of Marks and Spencer's. I wonder what Mike's doing these days, and will my bad pancake day joke be enough to have warmed up our relationship over the last few weeks? Probably not. But to get that Rolodex of examples, likewise, for you to attract introductions, share where you're going, share what you're up to, and you'll find yourself becoming much more magnetic to life-changing introductions yourself.
Some great thoughts there. And we don't want to get fixated on the idea of just introducing people over email, right? I think that's probably the default that most people will think is, CCing people into an email, introducing one to the other. But there's also a number of other ways where you can do that, sometimes all at once. I know you're a big fan of events as platforms for introductions. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly events, in the real world, we miss it, and virtually as well. I think getting people into the same room, into the same space. Truth be told, on the 2 occasions in the last few years where I've introduced people to their husbands and wives, all I really did, I wasn't really matchmaking, was I got them into the same space, and the rest is history. With events, that is fantastic, because you could just be doing it as your own salon. I see, Christine or Olivia on the call might say, look, I'm gathering a few like minds. That provides an amazing platform for people to bump into each other. And you will always be credited, emotionally at least, with having created the conditions for those 2 people to meet. I asked some of my nearest and dearest last week in advance of this call who I'd helped them to meet over the years, and probably 12 of them came back saying, I have lost track of the number of friends and connections I've made through your events. Which is a really lovely it cheers me up, put a spring in my step to hear. So I think events, hosting your own. What about if you get access to an event, asking if you might be allowed to bring someone along, maybe more than one? When the London Business Forum hosted Eric Schmidt to talk about The $1 Trillion Coach, a book about Bill Campbell, the Uber coach, I asked, slightly cheekily, if I could bring several people along to the event, several of whom met and became friends and business partners off the back of that intervention. Yeah, so I think there's an opportunity there as well, through events, through gatherings, and then from time to time, Nassos, I'm conscious of our time now, I will curate a specific conversation. So I asked 70 people at the end of last year, where do you want to go this year, and who do you need to meet to get there? And I noticed that 3 of them answered about supporting children and young people and taking an interest in the next generation of British politics. Off the back of that, I teed up almost like a little dinner party, really, but it was an hour-long Zoom call from 5 till 6 2 weeks ago. I won't bore you with the background, but one was a hugely successful household brand name entrepreneur. Another ran a very successful household name charity until recently. One of the best hours I've had this year. And all of them have gone on to do stuff off the back of that one phone call. Cost me 10 minutes thinking to set up, an hour of my time to be there for the meeting. And I genuinely think in at least one of those cases, it will have changed the trajectory of their next few years from that one Zoom call.
Yeah, it can be such a high impact thing to do. Really, really high leverage in terms of a little bit of time to do it and the results that it can generate. As we kind of wrap up this part of our Q&A, Ollie, and open up to questions, I just wanted to let's situate everybody in sort of after this call. Let's imagine that an introduction has come to mind, hopefully that seed's been planted. What do you think about in terms of getting, opt-ins from both parties, the mechanics of it? Just walk me through your thoughts on that. And of course, it will always depend on the context, the people, your relationship to them, but just talk me through that, because I think that will make it really practical for people and think about how can I actually go and make an introduction after this call or tomorrow if I want to.
Yeah, and I'm very conscious that everyone will have their own ways of doing this, but just let me share for you. And again, I say it on all these calls, my best friend is the sort of my sort of white A3 piece of paper where I start mapping. But let's say I'm talking to you, Nassos, about your journey. So question number 1 is, and let's say I wasn't talking to you actually. Let's say we hadn't caught up. I would start by mapping the people that you care about in the world of business, or more broadly. Okay, and just maybe jot a few of them down on a blank piece of paper. Ask yourself, how familiar am I with where those individuals want or need to go in the next few days, weeks, and months? And if you don't know, ask them. And that could be over a catch-up coffee or a Zoom. It could just be asking them a nice open question. You know, one of the most gifted people I've worked with this year, Rob Castell, singer, songwriter, musician. How confident am I that I really know where he wants to go in the next few weeks and months? I'm not confident enough. I need to ask him. Okay. Then you start to think about who Rob could or should meet to help him on his journey. Okay. Now, let's just say, for an example, that we thought that there might be some sort of power imbalance. Others will find that a provocative thought, so forgive me. But in some of those cases, the person I might introduce Rob to, I'm going to give him because he's a gifted, talented person, so I'm allowed to hopefully use that as an example, but there might be a power imbalance with who I want to put Rob in touch with. So really important for me, I don't just go around slamming people together. Why? Because if one of them is considerably busier than the other, then it can lead to a bit of tension and friction. Why are you doing this? You're bogging me down. I don't like it when people do it to me, not to sound ungrateful, so I don't do it to other people. So I have almost a double opt-in. I would write to the person I'm thinking of introducing Rob to, introducing the concept of Rob to them, saying why I think they could meet. Is it just because I think they'd get on? They'd hit it off? Is it because Rob needs help solving a particular problem? Is it because Rob might make a brilliant collaborator, which in the case I'm thinking of, I'm sure he would? Is there an extent to which I'm calling on the person's time as a favor to Rob or to me? All of that might sound like a lengthy process, but I ponder that within 20 or 30 seconds. What's going on here? Put that to them, and then potentially, if I know Rob would trust me to make a series of introductions anyway, I just go for it. But if that hasn't happened, I would have probably got a nod from Rob in the first place that introducing him to Steve Cleverly, head of Moshi Kids or Moshi Sleep, would be a good thing, right? So I'm thinking outside that. Then, crucially, in the email introduction, I make it absolutely clear how I know each of them and how well I've known each of them, or how long I've known each of them for. The reason to do that is if you don't do that, you will do like I did several times and got it badly wrong, and introduce one of your best friends to someone you met at last night's networking drinks. 2 weeks later, you get a call from someone, tell me about John. And there's that sinking feeling in your stomach when you realize John is flakier than he appeared after a glass of wine, and you've let one of your best friends down. So be absolutely clear how long you've known each for, and give them a gist about the type of conversation you think they should have. Lead them to it if you need to. I know that John is interested in exploring China, and Susie, I know you set up an office there last year. Lead them there if you need to. Is it a kindred spirits connection? And finally, what is the urgency or not of the connection? Very often, I will lace my intro emails with just the phrase, I hope you will cross paths at some point over the coming weeks. It's not urgent. It gives them full permission to ignore it or take their time. Yeah. If I think it's a problem-solving introduction, I make it much more urgent. I know that Sarah would usually appreciate just a few minutes of your time as soon as possible. Huge thanks. There I'm offering myself as a thanker as well as the introducing person as well. So I'm bundling myself into that equation, hoping we can pull on some time really quickly. So there's a bit of, probably too much information for some, but that's how I approach it and how I try and avoid some pitfalls as well.
No, it's brilliant to hear how you think about it, and hopefully that's incredibly useful for people in terms of the process that goes through making an introduction. Hopefully not intimidating, but the principles of that, if you apply them in your own way, you'll be well on your way to making some great introductions. So let's open it up.
By the way, so a couple of people now, so forgive me, commenting on that, and that's the Delancey Chess Challenge. It's the world's largest, actually, primary schools chess competition. But what I'm doing there, I hope Sarah wouldn't mind me mentioning, by the way, I have zero financial interest in this, is I am doing a mini 45 minutes for Sarah and her co-founder, where I'm going to invite interested people in supporting her journey along for a 45-minute Zoom, and we're just going to try and be as helpful as possible. So fingers crossed that 45 minutes will change her trajectory. So we're throwing helpfulness at a brilliant social entrepreneur. So it's just another technique in the armory, I suppose.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Well, let's get people asking questions. So feel free to post your questions in the chat. We've got a few already. Ollie Daisy asks, can you give us some examples of those nuggets you mentioned? Ways of keeping in touch with people in between asking them for connections or asking for help?
Yeah, number one technique. So I think keeping in touch is the thing that the people with the best networks in my life have done incredibly well, not just over weeks, but also over years, time zones, wearing different hats and so on. Technique number one, when you see something really interesting, share it with someone. I saw this and I thought of you. So in the Times today and on the Today program, someone's released a course. Would you believe it, Nassos? A university course around what the Times calls chit chat or networking. Okay, turns out Georgie from Trigger Conversations, I know. So I've done two things. Well, firstly, I was sent it as a WhatsApp at 7 o'clock this morning from a friend. So there, that friend is using a really great technique to say, I saw this and thought of you. Big tick. Okay. Secondly, I've used it to springboard by sharing it with you, Nassos, and a couple of others, but also as a trigger to write to Georgie, if that makes sense. So I've sort of done a bit of a sort of triangle on that particular one. So share stuff you find interesting along the way. Okay. Tip number two, just particularly with social media, just remember it's not about you. Yeah. If you spend most of your time on social pointing to other people's good work, you won't go far wrong. That could be through retweeting. It could be look over here, you know. You know, share other people's good work is an amazing way to keep in touch with a huge number of people. And tip number three, and again, a bit stealthy, but I have Google Alerts, as some might know, set up on a number of people. So I get a free email when they hit the news or the web in a new way. And I can use that to keep in the back of my mind what they're up to, but also from time to time to trigger a note in their direction. Either for good news, congratulations, I see you've done this brilliant thing, or bad news, I'm sorry to see you're having a rough time. So trying to give them moral support, particularly when they've hit some turbulence, and goodness, we don't need to look far to find that at the moment, keeps you supporting them along the journey. And they'll really appreciate it. They get bombarded the day they get a knighthood. They don't get as many emails the day the company goes bust.
Such a good point, you know, on the downside as well as the upside. Adrian asks, do you have a favored way of keeping track of connections and their status? Is it chucking it all in a CRM tool, or is there another way?
Yeah, so I don't have some middle of the volcano database system that I rely heavily on. I do use a number of Google, no financial interest in saying that, products, particularly in their contacts, their email, which I find so easily searchable, and the calendar function. I, of course, use my A3 pad. My number one technique for thinking about leveraging my network is find an accountability partner or buddy that you can talk through a part of your network with. And you will find that half an hour or 20 minutes over coffee, virtual or otherwise, if you spend that well over the next couple of weeks with the right accountability partner, just say, it might sound a bit strange, but you say, I'm thinking about how I get back in touch with a part of my network. I'm trying to be more helpful in making introductions. See, Anne Fisher, one of the great connectors out of Cambridge, I got to know through Silicon Valley Comes to the UK, supporting all sorts of scale-up companies. Think about someone in your network that could help you have that conversation. And you'll be amazed at the gold nuggets that drop out of that conversation, people that spring back to your mind. The other person might jolt a memory. Really, really powerful. And you can do the same for them.
Brilliant stuff. Lovely question here from Angie. I really like this, super practical and applied. I've recently had a connection who I occasionally see promise a charity founder they met at an event that I will give them free business advice. My contact then emailed me to ask me to get in touch with the said charity. So I'm interested to know, how would you deal with this to protect my reputation?
Oh, this is Nassos, this is so embarrassing, but I'm going to have to ask you, and I apologize to everyone. Can you ask me the question again? Because I got distracted by seeing all the wonderful people on the call, but forgive me. Everyone's got it apart from me. Just say the question again, because I don't want to give some fob off.
Absolutely, that's great. So I've had a connection promise a charity founder they met at an event that I'll give them free business advice. My contact, the same contact, then emailed me to ask me to get in touch with the said charity. How do I deal with this to protect my reputation? So connection has promised Angie that she'll give free business advice. They then got in touch to say, you know, are you going to get in touch with this charity to give the free business advice? How does she deal with the situation?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd check out. I mean, it sounds terribly obvious, so forgive the low-hanging fruit and stuff on the answer. Check out the charity and really check as to whether their cause is something you believe in. Because if it's not, it's going to be uphill all the way, isn't it? If you feel warm towards them, then just first of all, is there an opportunity to go back into the source who's made this offer to just in a friendly, upbeat way, just untangle what's happened a little bit? Because when you don't do that, you'll find exactly the same thing happens again the next week. And I've often got into being literally bombarded by my new best friend throwing people at me, and I've had to very politely say, I'm drowning. I'm so grateful for your support, but here's how I love to do these sorts of things. So see to what extent the cause is right. If you feel it's completely wrong, and frankly, you know, the donkeys in Greece are going to have to wait, then I wouldn't have any qualms at all in saying to your friend, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, and you might need to communicate that to the charity. As soon as you became involved in that, I'd start thinking on a slightly different level. What are the ways that you can encapsulate value for another organization in a contained, time-bound way? And very often that can be on a relatively short call. I don't think 20 minutes is offensively short these days. I certainly don't think half an hour is. You know, people on a previous call will know I have a number of surgeries, 4 half-hour slots, 2-3 times a week. And that enables me to help 8 or 12 people a week that otherwise I wouldn't have been able to cross paths with. But then think, what is the likelihood that our conversation in that half hour will grow legs and sprout to other forms of commitment and promise versus being able to contain value, enthusiasm, support, helpfulness, signposting in and of that intervention itself. And I think if you can tack towards the latter type of intervention, there's probably a win-win that leaves the charity feeling great. Weren't they helpful? Weren't they interesting? Weren't they a supporter of my life? It knocks off the opportunity for your hidden friend to do the same again. Or maybe it's a chance to get them better honed and say, do you know what? I really value valuable introductions, but here's how I think I can help people in particular, and here's who I'm particularly interested in meeting. So that's a verbose answer, and others will have different ways of solving that conundrum.
It's a really good way to frame it. I think obviously just my quick 2 cents. It's not really the other person's business to be promising your time, but as Ollie's talking about, what's a way that you can frame it? How can you make a win-win scenario emerge from a situation which, you know, might be slightly annoying or challenging? Some really great questions in the chat. I want to get through as many of them as we can. Yeah. Russ asks, did you ever have a connection you made that went horribly wrong, and how did you recover from it?
Now, I want to know which Russ is that, because there's quite a legendary Russ on the guest list. Who's asked that?
It's Russ Shaw.
Is it Russ Shaw? Right, okay, so I've got to say Russ Shaw is like the Uber connector, right? Founder of Tech London Advocates, founder of Global Tech Advocates. If you're not following Russ on Twitter or connecting to him on LinkedIn, please do. One of the most generous connectors I've ever met in my life. I have had connections which have gone wrong. Thankfully, none involving you. Quite the opposite, life-changing for the positive for you. They've normally come about because I have misexplained how I know the different parties. So I've tried to cover that off. Yeah, they've sometimes come about where I have tried to tangle myself up and become overly involved in the conversation. But those are the two absolute howlers that stand out to me, because it's, you know, a thoughtful introduction is a transfer of trust, and you mess with that at your peril. So if you're introducing an unproven, untrusted party, make it abundantly clear Anne has proven herself to be a trusted, thoughtful connector over several years of getting to know her. John, I met last night on a Zoom event, seems very interesting, and I'd love you to have a look at what he's doing.
I love the framing of an introduction as a transfer of trust. I think that really puts it in context. And
yeah, good to see Suki Fuller, another super connector on the call. Please do introduce yourself, everybody, if you're in the chat. This could be very sparky. By the way, 2 companies I'm lucky enough, certainly in one case I can say to be a shareholder in. Better Space would be an example. Came through the Zinc program, which is a phenomenal accelerator, zinc.vc. Another example would be Mobilize. Lots of good companies have come through it. But the point of the story, Nassos, is the only reason that they went into Zinc is because I recommended the Zinc program to the entrepreneurs. So there, I'm not even sure I made the introduction. I just said, you should know about this thing or this person. The only reason I know Zinc is because I met its co-founder, Ella Goldner, through Russ Shaw. How did that happen through Russ and Tech London Advocates? Because Ella had seen me emceeing an event and said, Russ, would you please connect me with Ollie? Okay, so asking for thoughtful introductions is literally life-changing. So I just think it's something we don't do often enough. So I think we should be bolder about it.
Absolutely. On the subject of declining introductions, Carol asks, how would you politely decline an introduction request? Perhaps because you don't feel it would be of mutual value or would be inappropriate. What's your take on that, Ollie?
Well, Carol, I don't know if I can speak to Carol about this, but do you mean someone's asked you to introduce you to someone and you don't want to do that?
Yes. Hi, Ollie. Thanks very much for the session. It's really helpful. Yeah, we at London Partners get asked all the time to be introduced, for example, to the Mayor of London, and we have to handle that conversation. So that's a very good example of where I mean.
Yeah, and it's letting people down gently. I mean, it's much easier to decline a request to a VIP in that situation. The way I tend to do it, and hopefully this doesn't sound like fibbing, I make it clear how bombarded that individual is. So when you're a shareholder in Calm, a lot of people want to meet Michael and Alex, the co-founders, yeah? And that's why I say, look, I'm sure they'd like to meet you under normal circumstances. They are unusually busy. What I can do is I can put your request to them. So I make it a one-sided opt-in. The other thing I do, if I can spot that there are certain interventions, because actually what people are doing very often is they're seeing somebody as a bit of a sort of talisman or a sort of, sort of representative. And nothing against Sadiq, he happens to be a personal friend. Clang, I'll pick that up later. But I think what they're actually meaning is, well, do you want to meet Sadiq Khan? Or do you want to meet the chair of his child obesity task force, Paul Lindley, or the managing director business of London and Partners, the brilliant Janet Coyle? Or maybe your scale up should go on the Mayor's International Business Program to take it to, Mumbai or New York, because actually Sadiq is a big believer in those programs. So without sounding like you're fobbing them off, you're saying, look, he's busy. The final question to me, Carol, would be, are there certain interventions when all of a sudden they become more accessible? Yeah. So I co-host Christmas drinks with Michael from Calm and Mark Adams, the head of innovation at Vice, every December. Come along to our Christmas drinks. And it might sound a bit, for third option, but are there encounters where they can bump into people that will make it a bit of a win-win? So that would be my other question.
Oh, thanks.
A couple more quick ones to finish up.
I'll be briefer. Sorry, you've got me into it.
No problem. I think the long answers are always good for context. Fran Schrepp asks, what cadence would you recommend to keep in touch with your network, and how do you keep track?
Now, is Franz on the call? Is that Franz from a well-known events platform?
Hey, Ollie. Yes. Happy to join. Great session so far.
Well, I'm very happy that Franz, who's like one of the founding team at Hopin, hasn't said, Ollie, why aren't you doing this event on Hopin? But anyway, that's for me to apologise to him later on. But what a gracious man he is. In terms of cadence, I think there's a difference between catching up with someone and finding other ways to check in and keep them posted. So I'd think about that. I'd think, what are you putting out into the world? So Franz would be a great use of Twitter and LinkedIn. Something we covered on last week's call, all these recordings will be made freely available, by the way, is if you broadcast something, what opportunity do you have to narrowcast it back to someone? So saying, look, I did write this piece about where the future of virtual events sits, but in particular, I thought of you. And I thought you'd like to read it. Yeah, I can see Franz making it because he's written a few good posts like this. Yeah, including Franz gave up his phone for a week, so making him think about how we use audio in different ways. So there might be a question on that coming in. So I think, if I've got an inner circle, if you like, of 100, 200 people, I like to think I can check in with them at least on a quarterly basis. Yeah, and sometimes much more besides. But very often I'm doing it through sharing something, through noticing something, or through brevity, asking them how they're getting on with something. So I think about those many different ways that you can check in with people.
Another couple of questions just to finish off. So Mordy asks, if you get the opt-in consent from 2 parties and introduce them and one doesn't follow up, I feel a sense of guilt or embarrassment. Can you speak to dealing with that situation? You know, do you follow up? How much do you pressure? What do you do if somebody doesn't follow up on one of the intros when they've opted in?
Well, I check in with the person that I thought was least likely. I check in with the person that I thought was most likely to follow up to see if it's happened. That's the first thing I do. Yeah. So one common thing that you will all be familiar with doing is where you BCC somebody in to save their inbox. Would be the vernacular you would use. So if I've introduced Susie and Jane, but I know that frankly Jane is completely swamped, then I'd say, Susie, did you manage to catch up with Jane? Yeah. And at the right point, I would either say to Susie, don't be afraid to give it a nudge. Yeah. Or I might say to Susie or Jane, I've forgotten who they are now, did this happen? And I sent one this morning. I use a particular turn of phrase, maybe because people think I'm being a bit cheesy, but I do it for search box findability. And I use the phrase connecting you now. And I use it either in the title of the email or somewhere in the email. And that just means on my Gmail, I can find all the introductions I've made at the click of a button. So I put in this morning, Gail, Belinda, connecting you now, ping, I can see exactly when I introduced them. And I fired off an email to one of them saying, how did this go? Luckily, it went incredibly well. So that's just my hack for finding my list of introductions. So don't be afraid to help it along. Also, there's a hidden rule here, isn't there? That in many of the introductions cases, you've been asked to make the introduction. So I would just say, think about how you reveal that in the connector email. Do you not reveal it at all? Do you try and keep the power balance between your 2 introducees, or whatever you want to call them, receivers, equal? If you want to keep it relatively equal, just say, hey, Michael, Barry, I think you're kindred spirits. I think you'll get on. Leave it like that. You could say, if Barry has given you permission to introduce Michael to him, Barry has kindly offered to share some of his time, or Michael has asked me to meet Barry, for example. I tend to be a bit more nuanced in the way I frame it, Nassos, which is to say, I know that Dame Julia would love to talk to Paul about children's health, and there it's implicit in my choice of words that Dame Julia has asked for the introduction. But I don't make it so crude that Julia immediately feels in Paul's debt.
Really useful thoughts there. Final question, and then we can have a bit of spillover towards the end of the hour for people who want to hang around. A topical one for you, Ollie. Alexandra asks, what do you think of Clubhouse? It's become quite popular for networking. I know you actually consolidated your thoughts on Clubhouse into a post or a tweet thread or something. So yeah, just tell us what you think of Clubhouse very quickly.
What do I think of Clubhouse? So Clubhouse is it's not that new, is it? It's been going since last May. It's audio only, it's drop-in chat. True confession amongst friends, I found it mildly addictive, actually. Second confession, I borrowed my partner's iPhone to try it out for a few hours one evening. And I could see why people were getting into it. It's like podcast meets talk radio meets events. I have concerns about Clubhouse. Am I convinced that it's safe in terms of how it handles data? I've seen a number of people leave WhatsApp holding their noses only to jump into Clubhouse, which amuses me. Am I convinced it's accessible for people who are hard of hearing, for people who happen to be blind? I'm absolutely not convinced. Am I convinced it's accessible if you don't have an iPhone, which I've always thought rather expensive, if you don't mind me saying? I'm absolutely not convinced. I've got lots of concerns. So I haven't jumped in with both feet. I'm interested in experimenting. I believe it, don't knock it till you've tried it. I wouldn't apply that to all crimes necessarily. However, I think it's intriguing, and I'm all for new ways of people connecting. Crucially, the things that loom furthest to the foreground, if you like, on Clubhouse are how to be a millionaire, how to create a personal brand. However, I think if you do some more digging, there are some really interesting voices to be heard, and that's why I want to continue to investigate.